On this episode of Road Scholars, we're going to be visiting a bunch of locations where presidents or future presidents have visited Erie.
We thought it would be fun, since Election Day is coming up, to talk about those presidential visits without having to talk about the election.
George Washington came to the area. If you remember in our Venango Path video, he came and surveyed.
So the next president that we want to talk about that came to Erie and made a visit to Erie was John Quincy Adams. He was the 6th president of the United States and actually served as an ambassador when George Washington was president. Now, Quincy Adams came here after he was president, when he was a member of the House of Representatives. And he arrived in Erie, right here in the bayfront, via steamboat. When he got off the steamboat, he was taken up into the city to meet with prominent businessman Rufus Reed. Now, we'll talk a little bit more in a future episode about Rufus Reed and the Reed family, as they were very important members of the Erie community. But he spent about 2 hours here, met with some of the local people, had a quick visit, and then he was off. So in 1849, Zachary Taylor was elected president, and he was from Virginia. And what he wanted to do was travel through the northern states to see what kind of things were happening up in the north. He wasn't as familiar with it. So he planned a visit to Erie, PA. Now, on his way from Pittsburgh to Erie, he got very, very ill. He made it as far as Waterford and couldn't go any further. They had to take a break. So they stopped in Waterford, and then he eventually makes it to Erie. He was supposed to stay in the building behind me, which is today the Erie Club, but back then it was the home of Charles Manning Reed. If you remember from the earlier part in the video, we talked about Rufus Reed. Charles Manning was Rufus Reed's even more successful son. So he was supposed to stay here. He never made it to the Reed Mansion. Instead, he spent his entire time down the street in a doctor's office. By the time he got to the doctor's office, things looked bleak. They expected Taylor to not live. In fact, the vice president, Millard Fillmore, was just up the lake in Buffalo, and they called him to Erie because they expected Taylor to die and that they were going to have to swear him in to become president of the United States. For the next week, Fillmore and Taylor spent their time in Erie, PA. Eventually, Taylor recovered, and Fillmore will go back to Buffalo on a steamship. Now, before he heads to Buffalo on that steamship, they decide that they're going to give him, the old cannon salute down at the bayfront on the USS Michigan. They go to fire off the cannon, and the cannon backfires and explodes and kills 7 people. It was a week full of mishap and tragedy.
The next president we're going to discuss is Abraham Lincoln. He was actually here twice. In 1861, he was traveling through the area on the way to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. Years before, an 11-year-old girl had written him, she was from Westfield, her name was Grace Bedell, that she thought he would look better with a beard. So as he's traveling through, he stopped here in Erie, and he stopped in Westfield to meet Grace, who had told him that he looked better with the beard. He did look better with the beard, and he won the election.
His next stop actually wasn't much of a stop. It came in April of 1865, and his train just passed through here in the early morning hours of April 25th. That train was carrying the body of a deceased Abraham Lincoln after he was assassinated and taking him back home to Springfield, Illinois, to his final resting place.
Here we are at the Erie Cemetery. Grover Cleveland was both our 22nd and our 24th president. He did not serve 2 consecutive terms, so there was somebody in between them. But he came in between his 2 presidencies because William L. Scott had been a member of the House of Representatives and one of the key advisors to Cleveland during his presidency. William L. Scott is a very famous Erieite. He was mayor here. He was the wealthiest member of the House of Representatives at the time. He raced horses all across the nation, and he was a huge railroad magnate. So Cleveland came and was a pallbearer for Scott's funeral. In 1901, our 25th president, William McKinley, came. Now, he wasn't here very long. He rode his train in. There was just enough time for the band to play some music, some cans to be fired. He was on his way to Buffalo. Buffalo was the site of the World's Fair that year, the Pan American
Expedition.
Yes.
Or exposition.
Exposition. Now, while he was there, he was struck by an assassin's bullet. He died 8 days later from gangrene. So 3 days after his visit here in Erie, he was struck by a bullet. 8 days later, he died.
What was crazy is that at the exposition, they had all kind of different exhibits and things like that. It's where people all over the country brought different rides, and it was sort of like a fair, but it was also a place to show new inventions. And one of the inventions that were there at the exposition was the X-ray machine. But they didn't use it on McKinley because it was just a brand new invention and they were afraid of the effects that it might have on the president. Sadly, he died 3 days later, and our next presidential visitor to Erie took over for him as the, 26th president? 26th president of the United States.
Before we jump in on the 26th president, McKinley has another tie here. McKinley actually went to Allegheny College, and he was actually quite the prankster when he was there. There's a number of stories about him bringing farm animals into various buildings on Allegheny's campus.
We believe that he probably was thrown out of Allegheny College down in Meadville because he took a goat up into the bell tower of one of those buildings. He eventually went to become a school teacher, and he ended up okay being president of the United States. So, back to Teddy Roosevelt, who came here. He visited Erie right after leaving the office of the president. Now, what we know about Teddy Roosevelt is he was sort of very much into conservation and saving our wildlife and our national forests and things like that. And he preserved thousands of acres of national forest out in the West. And that was really the mission of his trip here to Erie. He was on the back of a train, so he would have stopped right here at this train station. Thousands of people would have come to hear him give a speech in his very high-pitched, excited delivery. And he talked about protecting and conserving the waters of the Great Lakes and making sure that those Great Lakes stay clean. In 1911, William Howard Taft came to Erie, PA for a visit with local philanthropist and entrepreneur Charles Hammett Strong, who was a classmate of Taft's at Yale University. Taft delivered a speech at a sold-out Chamber of Commerce banquet at the Majestic Theater. He then went to church at the First Unitarian Church, followed by a visit to Strong's log cabin in the summer home. This wasn't the only visit that Taft made to the Erie area. The following year, Taft came back to Corey and gave a speech. In that speech, it's alleged that a young boy who was in the crowd fired a slingshot pea shooter and hit Taft right in the eye in the middle of his speech. According to local legend, while Taft was here in Erie on his original trip and staying at the Strong Mansion, he ended up getting stuck in the bathtub of one of the bathrooms in Strong Mansion. The bathtubs were small, and as you can tell from the images, President Taft was not a small man. Now, whether or not this really happened, we're not sure. It may have just been sort of campaign attacks against the former president.
Here we are at Union Station, Erie's train station. FDR was here. He was our 32nd president in August 15th, 1936. He was here on one of his whistle-stop campaigns. He actually never got off the train, though. In the back of the train, he made a 12-minute speech talking about the recovery that Erie was making during the Great Depression. The place was absolutely packed. In fact, the Erie Times News reported that every inch of Union Station's train level was jammed with cheering men, women, and children as the presidential special pulled in. The presidential special was the name of his train. Here we are inside of Union Station. In 1951, Mrs. Charles McCond wrote President Truman inviting him to visit Erie and see what Erie had to offer.
Truman didn't come in 1951, but he did make a visit in 1952 as he was leaving office. He came here via train, like most people traveled back in those times, and he gave a speech right off of the balcony behind us. These windows were doors, and you could walk right out onto the ledge and see people out in the front street. There he gave a speech on behalf of presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson did not win that election. That was won by Dwight Eisenhower. But Truman was here for a few minutes, and there were some pictures, and you can even hear his speech online if you Google it.
So we're on the corner of 10th and Peach, and this is the site that was pretty close to another presidential visit. Now, in this case, this was a candidate who would eventually become president of the United States in 1960, John Kennedy. John Kennedy came here when he was running for president while he was still senator from Massachusetts. He stayed right down on this block in what was the Lawrence Hotel. It's no longer there. It was demolished in 1968. But this would have been a thriving area for both the arts and visitors to come into the city. So Kennedy was here to give a speech and to have a fundraising breakfast. They charged $25 a plate for breakfast, and it was full to capacity. Kennedy gave a speech. He spent the night. Now, while he was here, he had throngs of people. They said as many as 40,000 people saw Kennedy travel from the airport over to here or at one of his events while he was in the city. And he was very excited to be here. This was only a few days after the very first televised debate. Prior to that point, television wasn't popular in 1960, and they didn't televise the debates. That debate is probably what sent Kennedy over the top, because he was young, he looked very strong, the ladies thought he was handsome. It probably put him over the top and helped him win that election. So he was sort of riding high off of winning that debate, coming into Erie, giving some speeches, and then he carried that right on in to win the presidency.
More recently, we've had a number of presidents and former presidents and wannabe presidents come to the Erie area. For instance, Bill Clinton was here after he left office in order to campaign for both his wife in 2008 and then Barack Obama and his wife in the 2012 and 2016 elections. Barack Obama was here in 2008 at Penn State Barron to give campaign speeches. And finally, our current president, Donald Trump.
Here we are at Erie Airport. This is the site of where Donald Trump visited on October 20th, 2020. This was his third visit to Erie. His second time here as president. He was here in 2018 at the Civic Center. He came in 2016 when he was campaigning for his first presidency. So he came here to campaign and to ask people to vote for him.
So as you can see, Erie has a very interesting history of presidential visits, from the very first president to our current president.